Welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine with Pick and Pay. Welcome to the Maslow Hotel in Sandton, one of my favourite spots in South Africa. They've got some great restaurants. It's a terrific place to stay, and it is the venue for a really cool conversation, one I've wanted to have for a while, because it's about a style of wine that I feel is a little neglected in South Africa. It's a lovely style. It's a style that we do incredibly well, but we just don't drink enough of it, we don't celebrate it enough, and today hopefully we can turn that around, because not only do I have some of South Africa's finest port style wine, or Cape Vintage as we call it here, so as not to upset the Portuguese, but I've also got one of the finest port style winemakers, not just in South Africa, but just about anywhere. Boets, welcome.
Thank you, it's wonderful to be here.
Right, it's a great brand you have in Krans. It's done incredibly well. You make some terrific port. Or Cape Vintage, as we call it here, but it almost wasn't ever part of the South African wine landscape, because this arrived in, what, 1973, purely by accident?
Yeah, well, that was really a big accident, but I think one of the best that ever happened in Karlsdorp. My father and his brother, when they were at the Krans, they decided in 1973 they wanted to extend their vineyards and they wanted to plant the first red grape variety. So they went to the Swartland. Obviously, the Swartland is very similar in terms of climate to Karlsdorp. And they decided that Shiraz does well there, so they're going to plant Shiraz. And they came back, ordered the vines, and they planted the Shiraz. And 4 years later, when it started bearing grapes, they all of a sudden realized that this didn't really look like Shiraz. You know, the berries were a little bit bigger and the leaves were looking much more different. And then only they realized it was Tinta Barocca. So that was really where the port industry started in Karlsdorp. So in 1977 they made a bit of a red wine from it. It was a very good quality. And then in 78 they started making port wine from it as well, you know, as we call it now, port style wine. And it was an immediate success. And you know, just a year or two after that, people started talking about Karlsdorp as the port capital of South Africa. So that's where it all started.
And it's been a raging success story ever since. The wine that you make, it is wine for people who don't know too much about the broader space, but it's wine made in a different style. How do you get this particular wine, and what differentiates it from, say, a normal bottle of red or a normal bottle of Tinta Barocca?
A port is actually what they call a fortified wine. Now, when it's a fortified wine, you have to add alcohol to the wine. So basically, what happens is you make it the same way as you would make a red wine. You ferment it in an open lagar or a concrete fermenter. And then when you get to the right alcohol or the right sugar of about 90 to 100 grams per liter of sugar, you just add alcohol and the fermentation stops there. So the yeasts are all killed, then the fermentation stops, and then it's basically the port. So after that, it's wood maturation and all of that. But that's the biggest difference. The one is a wine the red wine is fermented finished, and a port is a fortified product.
You also have a slightly sweeter, slightly heavier product, a little bit more alcohol. How much alcohol would be in a regular bottle of port, and how much sweeter is it than a regular wine?
Well, a wine is usually, if you talk about a dry red wine, it's usually about 5 grams per liter of sugar or less. Whereas a port is, you know, a traditional port that is made in the Douro Valley and also in Karlsdorp is around about 90 to 100 grams per liter of sugar. But then you must remember you've got much higher alcohol. So the alcohol is between 18 and 19, sometimes even close to 20%. So yes, it's much more of a bigger body and a bigger product altogether.
And the result, I think, is fantastic.
Yep.
It's a type of wine that I love, and it's a type of wine that you often find, I remember my grandparents used to, it was either port or sherry, but there's always a tiny little glass of it. I see what we have here is not a tiny little glass. I'm very happy because it means I can have more, but it's not just the volume. There's an important reason that you've got these glasses.
Yeah, you know, I think we must totally steer away from these port or sherry glasses. They are, not only that they are not looking nice, but you know, you can't really taste the port in a glass like that. You must remember, as you said earlier, port is a wine, and you must be able to smell the wine, you must be able to get the lovely aromas of a port. And if you will only still pour, say, maybe 50 ml in the glass, but you've got so much more that's coming from the flavors of the wine than in a full filled up small glass.
All right, well, that is a natural conduit to tasting some of this fantastic Cape Vintage of yours. What are we going to start with today, Boets?
I think we'll start with the Cape Pink. Now, the Pink is a wine. It's actually a summer port-style wine. And the reason why we started making this in 2008, myself and my brother sat together and we said, you know, it's a hard life that we're having with port, because we're trying to sell to people only 2 or 3 months of the year, and then the winter is gone and then it's summer again. So we wanted to make a rosé style of port that you can actually have in the middle of summer. So this is a wine that I can pour you a little bit, that you can taste it. This is a wine that you will have in the middle of summer. You can have it on crushed ice. You can have it even as cocktails, obviously. There are many different cocktails that you can make from a pink port. But also in winter, you can have it slightly chilled, and you can have it with nuts, olives, pate, and things like that. So it's really a versatile wine, but it's very light-bodied. It's made from the Portuguese grape varieties, and maybe just when I'm talking about the Portuguese grape varieties, in South Africa, the most important varieties are Touriga Nacional, which is the Mercedes, or in my case, the Isuzu of grape varieties in South Africa. And then Tinta Barocca gives you the lovely structure in the port wine. So that is very important for the wine to age, the Tinta Barocca part in it. And Tinta Rich, or as you would call it in Spain, Tempranillo, that is also important. Give you good color, good structure, and good flavor. And then the last one that we use is Tinta Amarela. So that's basically the four most important grape varieties that we use for port. And this is also the grape varieties that are in here. So basically, we make this wine the same way that you would make a rosé. We will just bleed off maybe 10% of the ruby. So just after crushing to get this very nice and light color. It's got beautiful flavors of candy floss, of strawberries and so on. And then unwooded, just fresh and friendly. That's it.
You've sold me on it. And there's a wonderful lightness to it. All right, one down. We're 1 from 1.
Yeah.
Thoroughly enjoyed that. What's next on our list?
Well, the next one is the Premium Cape Ruby. So the Cape Ruby is, I'm just going to...
And you can certainly taste the sugar. You know that it's sweeter, but it's not a cloying sweetness. It's it feels balanced. It feels like it just feels so right.
I think that's where, you know, in the beginning when South Africa started making port-style wines because we've been making in the late 1800s already, there's been port-style wines made in South Africa. But those wines were quite a bit sweeter than we are making them now. They used to be 110, 120, even to 140 grams per liter of sugar. And they tended to be too sweet and in sort of too jammy as well, you know. But if you make a port, you must make sure that the grapes are not overripe when you pick them, so that they are, you know, they call it Oumans gesiggie, you know, like more or less like my face. You must make sure that it's, before you get to Oumans gesiggie, old man's face, before you pick it. And in that way, you make sure that the wine has got this lovely dry finish and fruity and not jammy. So that's important for a port.
Very happy with number 2. What's our number 3 for today?
The number 3 is, you know, in South Africa you get vintage, and then you also get a Cape Vintage Reserve. By the way, we always will call it a Cape Vintage or Cape Ruby, and not just a vintage, because it's from the Cape, it's from South Africa, and we are also allowed to use these expressions in Europe as well.
You can see it's visibly darker than the predecessor.
And this wine is a great wine, a very versatile wine. People tend to think that if you drink a vintage or a vintage reserve, it's only a wine that you have with cheese or after a meal or something like that. You know, I went to a restaurant down in Van der Bijl Park end of last year, and he told me about the beautiful kebabs that he has. And I said to him, have you ever tried the Cape Vintage with these kebabs? You know, because they're beautifully made, very juicy and all of that. And now he's selling it as a complimentary glass with a kebab. So you can actually have it with your main meal, with a medium rare steak, with ostrich, with many things. So don't always think of a port-style wine that's the end of the meal and it's only winter. It's much more versatile than that.
And already a very, very different colour.
Yeah. Now this is what I call the bank manager's wine, because it's a hard wine to make, and unfortunately, I don't know why, but it's the same in the UK. People would pay more, or would be prepared to pay more for a vintage, a proper vintage from the Douro or Cape Vintage Reserve from South Africa, than for a properly made tawny. And it's actually much more expensive to make a tawny, because this wine, it starts, the wine when it's young, it would be something in between the Cape Vintage and the Cape Ruby. And then it stays in the barrel for up to 10 years or even longer if you have a very friendly bank manager. And then it loses that color, that ruby color. It becomes more, it's lighter in color, but it's also the color that you get is much more of a brown tint, amber tint to the wine, a tawny color. And the flavor spectrum changes completely. From the fruit, it goes to more of that nutty flavors, cinnamon, lots of spice in it, some coffee flavors. So it becomes very complex and very soft and accessible, because it's been in a barrel for 10 years.
Yeah, you're right. It's a lot more savoury in its feel to the fruit of the previous ones.
Yeah, tawny is maybe the most versatile of all styles of port. You can have it with something like a brown onion soup, especially in winter when it's chilly outside. Have it with an onion soup. You can have it with spicy dishes. Friends of mine a few years ago, they got married, and it was a French girl and an Indian guy. And when all the visitors came out of the church, they were served with a samosa and a glass of tawny, and it was beautiful. I mean, it was an excellent idea.
All right, 4 splendid examples down, but now for the big one.
Yeah.
And as we come to this last one, which I see has got some very impressive stickers on it, it's been celebrated right around the world. What sort of pricing am I looking at for these 5 bottles?
Well, the pink is around about 65 to 70 rand retail. The ruby about 85, vintage 115, the tawny about 250, and this would be about 375 rand.
I'm really looking forward to this. I have had it before, and I suspect I'll be having it a lot more in the future. Oh, that is glorious. It's just striking that balance between the sweetness and the structure and getting such a complete wine.
Yeah, in the past, if you look at the good old Douro ports, some of them, like the 1970 was a great year, 77 was a great vintage as well. They were made in a much bigger style than this, and also in a much bigger style than they make it now. If you look at the 2011 the vintage that they brought out, it's definitely made in a more elegant style, and the reason for that is their market changed mostly to the US, so they are buying more of the vintage ports now than the UK, and people tend to store wine less. They want, when they buy a wine, the wine must be accessible and must be drinkable at that stage. So it's really quite a trick to make a wine that will last long, because we say these wines will last 30 to 50 years at least, and I think we've proven it, starting to prove it now. Our first one is in 1991 and it's still a baby, so I think it should get there. But in the same time, it must also be accessible when you launch it after 2 or 3 years, so it's quite a feat. Yeah.
Well, this certainly is.
This is a great wine to have with the strong cheeses. And as I always tell friends of mine, if you're a cigar smoker, this is about the only wine that you can drink with a cigar. Because the rest, the cigar will kill the wine, but not this one.
This one's up to the job. So as we wrap up, just to recap, make sure you drink your Cape Vintage, your port style, in a big proper glass so you can appreciate it. Make sure it's at the right temperature. Pop it in the fridge for half an hour before you drink it, just to be sure. try not to drink it for anything more than 2 or 3 weeks, so that you're getting the best out of it. And in the case of, I think pretty much all of these, look at the versatility of them and the fact that you can eat them with all sorts of different, drink them with all sorts of different food, and just have a lot of fun with them.
Very much so. There's one saying that I always believe in, that I read in a book from a Portuguese producer, that they say any wine would love to be a port if it only could. So I hope I proved a little bit of that today.
You certainly have. As I said right at the start, I feel it's a slightly neglected variety, but it is a variety done brilliantly, and the Krans are the perfect example thereof. That vintage reserve is a 5-star platter wine with 96 points from Tim Atkin, but across the board, some really, really good, really strong examples of what we've taken from Portugal, and I'd like to think improved. So it's not just Nando's and Genie D, we've also got our port-style wine. It's De Krans's flagships, through to its pink, a wonderful selection. And if you haven't tried port-style wine before, this is a really, really good place to start. And if you're looking to do a little bit of wine shopping, remember, jump online to Pick n Pay, have a look at their wine store. They can deliver to you, and you can add to your collection, including some of the dessert-style wine. Boets Nel, thank you very much indeed, and hopefully the next time I see you will be at the Krans, possibly with one of those legs of lamb that your wife makes.
Would be wonderful, thank you.
And celebrating.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity.
Great pleasure. See you again next week. Cheers.